Today's video is going to start by playing a 2-minute clip, which we are then going to analyze its conclusion. And the clip is from the PBS documentary Via Frontline on the rise of RFK Jr. It is a 2-hour documentary which was recently released around October 22nd, 2025.
If there's fight or flight, he fights. He sees it as a real affront. He believes that what he's spreading is not misinformation. It's just sort of, making people more fully informed about vaccines, even though what he's spreading is misinformation. And this is really when the seed of the idea to run for president is planted, because what really gets him going is, well, if I ran for president, they'd have to restore my social media accounts.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
I was at his announcement in Boston. It was incredible. And they felt that he was the savior. It was Masonic. He's a populist. I thought that everyone was swept up.
As he made his announcement, he wasn't going to let his past hold him back.
I'm going to put my cards on the table. I'm not an ideal presidential candidate. I had a rambunctious youth, and it lasted until my early 60s. And I told my wife the other day, I said, I got so many skeletons in my closet that if they could vote, I could be king of the world.
He told me in my interview with him that he wanted to run because he felt he'd been muzzled. Kind of a strange reason to run for president, given that he's a Kennedy and he already had a platform. But, claiming that the world's against you has always been part of his narrative.
This is what happens when you censor somebody for 18 years.
Some people think RFK Jr. is a savior. Some people think that he is a maniac whose ego, whose desire to prove that he's capable is part of an anti-vaccine agenda, which can result in the deaths of countless numbers of people. Either way, the role that RFK Jr. has, the visibility that he has, is undeniably important and meaningful. So when he was announcing that he was running for president, and I was there in this crowd, although just off to the right here, it's noteworthy that in the second row, center, perhaps the most important seats of the entire audience of someone who is among the most politically important families in the history of the United States are to the left, that is Jill Glasspool Malone, and to the right, that is a man named Robert Malone, or Dr. Robert Malone, who is a key focus of this particular video. Is it just coincidence that the most important seat is filled by the person who was the whistleblower in one of the most visible catastrophes in experimental gene therapy, and that was the death of Jesse Gelsinger in 1999 and 2000, and that person also is supposedly the whistleblower that went to the New York Times and spoke to Cheryl Gay Stolberg, New York Times editor, who is, by the way, also featured in this RFK Jr. video. Can it be any coincidence that this is the person that set up the IT infrastructure in the middle of nowhere cancer research hospital now owned, amongst, by all people, Patrick Soon-Shiong in Pennsylvania, that's only 10 miles away from the Flight 93 crash site, and is the only place that had effectively outside access to cancer data within the United States military, something that would have been very, very important should the U.S. military have been mandated to take an experimental anthrax gene therapy vaccine after September 11th, or 2001, or should I say, the planned biological terror event in 2001. Can it be any coincidence that the person in the most important seat at that event is also the individual whose patents at Vical Corporation were being used as part of the anthrax vaccine? I should say the DNA anthrax vaccine, not the one that they were trying to scare people away from, that was made in Michigan. How is it possible that the most important seats at this RFK Jr. announcement that he's running for president is filled by the person who, we are led to understand, ran a program which called the Domain Program, which actually determined all, and I mean all, of the potential countermeasures which could be used in response to COVID, as a program which was basically written over the course of a couple of weeks and I guess ran perfectly and gave us everything from remdesivir to ivermectin and the rest of the very limited selection of options in response to COVID 19.
We're going to call tonight's show Motive. Hello, Christy. Christy kind of gave me the idea. First off, before I get started, extra special thanks to Janet out there. Thank you. Big difference. Really going to help this month for what you sent in. Thank you. And we need to get serious. They need to get serious about finding a place and scheduling a date and so on for an event in 2026, Bio 911 Truth, BIO 911 Truth. And that's sort of what tonight's show is about. It's this concept of motive regarding what the heck happened on the day of September 11th in 2001. Now, I'll be the first to tell you that there has to be things that I'm missing because I'm still finding things myself. So I certainly am not suggesting that every little detail of the biggest story and every small narrative is figured out here. I don't have it figured out. However, I am as confident about what I'm about to say as anything I've ever felt since I asked my wife to marry me, really, that what is an underpinning issue regarding September 11th, 2001, and all of those terrorist events, and what has been behind the scenes driving things for the last 20, 25, 30 years, has been a combination of the advancement of technology and fighting for and control over funds relating to taking control of and advancing knowledge of the human genome, knowledge of the machinery of human life and how to both destroy it and to control it and advance it has been at the top of the national security agenda for 50, 70 years, at least. Yes, I know people have been subjected to mythologies of other types of weapons of mass destruction, but based upon everything I've seen, when it comes to the most important meeting at any event, yeah, they'll talk about currencies and they may talk about climate issues and other resources, but even those things are colored by a future where we are all marching towards this potentiality of taking control over life, taking control over the evolution of the human species. Now, this isn't to say that we've reached any level of mastery yet at all. I think a lot of that is smoke and mirrors. And the movie War Games with Matthew Broderick was a big part of what led me to having a career in the computer fields. My parents separated when I was very young. By the way, Mark Kulak, Houstonic.live, 745, Sunday, October 26, 2025. And my mom's side, which raised me, many people working in as nurses, but most importantly in law enforcement, detectives, and so on. And really not many people who were working in the mechanics area, although mechanically inclined, and definitely not working with computers. And when I saw the movie War Games, I was probably about 10 years old. That I was like, wow, those machines are just so fascinating. And I never had a computer up until then. I never used one. This is 1983. So that movie, I talk about it a lot. I think it is of national significance, but it also how it impacted me. Now, as it turned out, many years later, decades later, when I reconnected with my biological father, as it turns out, yeah, he was a computer person. He worked as a mechanic. He maintained computers and compute machinery from a mechanical standpoint. He also taught inner city kids how to build their own computers in Bridgeport, Connecticut, on his own dime. So he was a really good person as far as that goes. But the movie War Games inspired me to want to, what's up with those big machines that do all these funny things with information? I found that to be fascinating. And that's kind of what led me to making decisions to go into the field of computer engineering. I was never really a hacker, but I just wanted to understand how the machines worked inside. Because of this, I watched the movie many times. It's not necessarily the best acting ever. Okay, it's obviously played up. But I watched it many times for that reason. But there's other things that happen in the movie War Games as well. So in some ways, I was lucky to have watched that movie so many times because I was picking up on other things that now are important. By the way, for those who haven't seen it, I'll give you a quick backstory on the storyline, okay? The movie War Games in 1983 is about a U.S. military program where they created a enormously powerful computer called the Whopper, W-O-P-R, which actually does nothing but 24 hours a day, chess games and simulations about what would happen in the event of a World War III, where you have the launching of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and then you have a missile defense system and so on. And the story is that the real-life people that were working in missile silos and within the United States or wherever the United States had it, missile silos, sometimes would get second thoughts and cold feet when it comes time to press the button. So they would be ordered to press buttons, ordered to launch missiles at a certain time at the start of World War III, but sometimes they got cold feet. So the government said, let's make a more powerful computer. Let's take people out of the loop. Let's just put all missiles under total control over a centralized computer system. And I know there's some aspects of this which are sort of played out in the movie Terminator as well. Yeah, it is science fiction. And eventually the computer goes through some mood swings, and then it decides, based upon some bad evidence, that maybe World War III is really starting, so they have to hack into it. And there's a lot of other sub-stories. But the idea is that this is where the military is going. And we're going to be investing in big computers. And also, there's this seed that mutually assured destruction, whatever the phrase is, right, where everyone just winds up killing everyone else once the world starts, suggests that maybe this whole idea of World War III is silly. Now, the movie sort of gets you to think that. It doesn't say that war will never happen again, but it gets you to think, now that war is going to be controlled by computers, and now that people can just sit in a cave somewhere with a bunch of computers and press buttons and everything happens, why do you need a military? Why do you need soldiers? Why do you need tanks? You can just take care of everything from central command. And there we are in 1983. Now, also during 1983, though, the United States military is taking on one of the largest pork barrel projects. Hello, Carrie. I hope you're finding this. Oh, you saw it at a theater. Lucky you. So the idea is that, what do we need a military for? But during the 1980s, the fear of nuclear warfare and mutually assured destruction is driving the U.S. military to want to create a intelligent intercontinental ballistic missile defense system. Basically a way to be able to shoot down missiles which are coming at the United States or U.S. territories from somewhere remote. This is called the Strategic Defense Initiative. It has a couple of other names, Strategic Defense and Threat Initiative, and it has also been renamed or nicknamed Star Wars. The Star Wars project is massive, massive. So not only do we have to make missiles now, but now we have to make missiles with advanced computers which know how to find other missiles and shoot them down. And this project goes on for 10 or 15 years. A lot of technology comes out of this. There's a lot of wasted projects out of the United States government, as there is with every government. I don't think any one government has it quite figured out. As someone who is technical and an engineer, this may not be the greatest justification, but if you're going to waste money on something, you know what? If you can advance computers, if you can create these technical challenges where you get a lot of people to work together, and it can be good for the national morale. There's worse things to do with money, which is already being printed anyways. So I'm not like rigidly against this stuff. Although now that I realize what the computers are used for, I'm starting to second guess some of this. Regardless, more comes out of it than just a missile defense system. There were major advances in computing throughout the 1980s and 1990s, enormous advances. There were enormous advances in computer networking. And a lot of these things, the benefits come out of these government research programs. Patents wind up in colleges, and then before you know it, little startup companies happen and so on. And it fostered a lot of innovation and a lot of new businesses and so on. No one can say that there hasn't been a preponderance of new companies and new ideas and dramatic leaps forward in the information processing industry in the United States of America. No one can say otherwise. And I think a lot of this happened because of Star Wars. But the military right now, during the 1980s, is starting to get slowly starved for money. People don't want to spend as much money on new planes and new aircraft carriers and more tanks and so on. So even though you may have seen a lot of war action movies in the 1980s, military budgets are, they're creaking along. And it's only the threat of nuclear war which is allowing for any type of
Budget sustainment.
really to happen. Of course, there was the conflict involving Kuwait. That resulted in a short-term boom. But the United States economy as a whole is not necessarily growing like gangbusters anymore. The U.S. population isn't growing like gangbusters anymore. That's a big part of this. There's more people can live older and get to retire, but family size is starting to go down throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Our debt levels are starting to go up. This stuff is all happening for real. And there are more than a few people who believe, and this includes people in the military, by the way, that the greatest national security threat is not nuclear weapons, not atomic weapons from another country being launched into the United States. It is mastery and control of this research project into the human genome. That's really where it's at. Building a strategic defense against missiles from other countries is just a wonderful way to be able to learn a lot about rocketry. It learned a lot about things related to efforts of space exploration. That's true. That did happen. And also a wonderful excuse to advance computing. But it's also not directly called learning about the human genome. Now, meanwhile, there are other efforts ongoing that want access to more funding from the United States government that are more directly associated with understanding the human genome. Far more than, hey, we're going to protect the United States against missiles from Russia or the Soviet Union, as it was back then. So you have a turf war of sorts. And there are legitimate points to be made on all sides of this. I'm not a pro-war person at all. However, I do appreciate the fact that there are threats to the United States, and they don't necessarily come in the form of other countries wanting to march their tanks into the United States. Likewise, I understand if you want to advance computing, if you want to have a good project that's going to bring a lot of people together, the study of genetics is quite fascinating. Why not? I don't think we should try to take over the role of God, but I think it's totally in line with almost every known religion to want to dig in and gain and have more reverence for and just learn how the heck does this stuff work. But just like the military, we see wars sometimes being taught or started for whatever reason, and they're not started by the military, but they have to participate in these things. We see potentially engineered health problems starting to justify other stuff. I mean, whatever AIDS is, there was a greatly increased number of deaths in certain populations. And it was being described as an HIV, a brand new emerging virus epidemic. Would that have happened if there weren't people who were interested in advancing the science of vaccines and advancing knowledge of the human genome? That's a good question. That is the question. So there are decisions being made that allow a certain level of moral flexibility, which can result in killing people. And that is now also a part of it. And people need to see this. It's generally understood that the military interest and the military-industrial complex may be involved or has been involved in things which resulted in deaths of both American and foreign people, even innocent civilians overseas and so on, as a byproduct of various agendas which are not always clear and sometimes not even known at all. And people have a knowledge of this. They know it. It's real. But when it comes to the flip side, it's not quite as obvious, because a person is almost thrown into the nut job prison if they even question the use of an intramuscular injection to provide people some level of augmented immunity and protection against pathogens. You can't even question that. So here we are. And throughout the 1980s, we see a turf war brewing over limited dollars. Now, there's another thing that we have ongoing as the 1980s advance, as HIV advance. HIV is being discussed throughout the 1980s and the 1990s as providing a backbone technology which can be used for the administration of gene therapy. Let me repeat that. HIV is seen as an emerging disease or emerging virus which provides technologies which can be used and repurposed for gene therapy, for a new era of vaccines, for a new era of cancer treatments. And this is being controlled by whom? By academic institutions, by the National Institutes of Health, by Health and Human Services, which includes all of the sub-agencies, the CDC, and so on. And the U.S. military is also invested in this. The U.S. military is also doing HIV research because they know they have to. This is the real battlefield right now. Throughout the 1990s, you'll see that overall funding of the United States Department of Defense was going down year over year. So this is American defense spending in historical and international context. So you can see, as of 1997, it was down to 3% of GDP. This is the lowest it was, and the trend was to go down further. Now, even then, the U.S. military still was the most well-funded military, but it's going down, and it's having to spend even more on projects such as space defense and things related to genetics. But the trend is to go down. The trend is to go down. At one point in 1957, American defense spending as a share of GDP was 13%, and it has gone down all the way to 3%. Where are the people who are always screaming about the military-industrial complex controlling everything in this chart? They're nowhere to be found, as a matter of fact. But here it's going down, and it's leveled off right there, right at this 3%. So the U.S. military is now, as of 1997 and after 5 years of the Clinton administration, poised for even more budget reductions. And then a really gross idea comes out. And this idea starts to emerge around 1996, okay? And here's the idea. The idea is this. What if, when it comes time to trying out this brand new experimental gene therapy that we are working on throughout the Human Genome Project, that is controlled by the NIH and is protected by the United States Department of Energy, who are we going to try it out on? Who's going to sign up for it? It's going to be hard to find people. Also, in the year 1997, and even the projections for the next couple of years, do not suggest that there's going to be the capability, the worldwide computing, the national computing, or the capability to collect data on the population in general, looking at this chart. It's not going to be there. But it just so happens that there's only one population, 3 million strong, albeit, even though the funding is going down. One population of people that has to take vaccines if they are told to do so. And because of the VA, they will be tracked, their health data, to the maximum of the technical capabilities until the day that they die. And that is the U.S. military. So while the U.S. military is being spoken of as, look, guys, the land wars are a thing of the past. You have missile defense right now. What the heck do we need you for? We should be spending our money on all kinds of other various initiatives, on technical initiatives, on genetics, and so on. And someone, I think, again, I'm being a little colorful here and a little bit loose on some of these details, but someone has the bright idea, you know what? The United States military has 3 million people who can't say no to an experimental vaccine, and they're going to be tracked until the day that they die. Maybe we should keep them around. Or if the U.S. military has reached a point where they can't be made any smaller, maybe we can do great damage to the U.S. military if we are an infiltrating force within the United States by subjecting them to hot, non-placebo experimental gene therapy shots, which could be potentially highly carcinogenic. And the way which we're going to do this is we are going to make the future about biological terrorism. And in order to be protected, they're going to need to take new types of shots. And they will be tracked. Starting in the year at the end of 1996, the word bioterrorism was created. It was only used once beforehand, 10 years before, and it was sort of thrown out there by Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, who wound up, by the way, receiving one of the anthrax letters 14 years later. And then, starting in 1996 and 1997, I challenge you, look at congressional agenda. It's nonstop talk for 3.5 years about biological terrorism. There are, every month there's a meeting in Congress for almost 4 years to talk about the Human Genome Project, to talk about HIV, to talk about biological terrorism, to talk about the rights of the U.S. military and saying no to anthrax vaccines. This was the talk for 4 years. For 4 years. And all of these other interesting stories were bleeding out. And if there was a biological terror attack on the United States, it would mean that the U.S. military, in order to be protected against whatever that threat was, maybe small anthrax, will need to take a vaccine. Now, sadly, there's a little bit of a hiccup here, though there's two. One of the hiccups, they were trying to convince people that there was an existing anthrax vaccine that was very deadly, and that the existing anthrax vaccine made in Michigan was deadly and couldn't be made fast enough and was painful and inefficient. Merrill Nass, in fact, Robert Malone's friend, was part of working with U.S. military personnel to show how victimized they were if they were required to take the old anthrax vaccine, something that the new anthrax vaccine would have solved, even though we don't even need to think about how effective that would have been. So now here we are, and if there's a bioterror attack, the U.S. military, in order to respond to it, is now going to have to receive some type of protection. And it's going to be the new anthrax vaccine. Now, there's several types of new anthrax vaccines. One of them could have been adenovirus vectored, maybe. And the adenovirus vectored one was actually being tested on a young 18-year-old, not an anthrax vaccine, but a therapy which was being delivered through an adenovirus vector technology. And that resulted in that 18-year-old dying. This is the Jesse Gelsinger case. And that was in 1999. As luck would have it, Robert Malone wound up going to the New York Times as a whistleblower about what happened in that case. As luck would have it, the person that Robert Malone went to in 1999 and 2000, a woman named Cheryl Gay Stolberg, was one of the prominent voices on the most recent PBS Frontline series about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. As luck would have it, someone that Robert Malone had been co-authoring papers with, a man named Inder Verma at the Salk Institute, ran those hearings about what went wrong with Jesse Gelsinger. So Robert Malone is all over this already, right there. And there's a stock for a company that made DNA plasmids, Vical Corporation, where Robert Malone had his patents. Then the stock started to go down after that because it was discovered that there might have been some problems already in the works. And the stock went down even further after September 11th, 2001. In fact, the anthrax vaccine that was being worked on in Columbus, Ohio, was with someone that Robert Malone ultimately worked with, a man named Daryl Galloway, which used the Vical DNA plasmids from the Vical Corporation that Robert Malone had worked with. I put out there a challenge for other citizen journalists to say the word Vical, V-I-C-A-L, and none of them will. They all dance around it and run away like cowards. Or, that again, they're doing what they're paid to do. They're not supposed to mention it. Vical Corporation, by the way, stayed around for another 18 years and closed up shop on October 20th, 2019. A couple weeks before COVID-19. Oh, you watched that hearing. Good for you, Kerry. There's another one, by the way. So that was the hearing for Jesse Gelsinger, I think was in 1999. And then there's other hearings. There's several. Look for Christopher Shays, the previous senator from Connecticut who ran them, regarding the rights of soldiers to say no to experimental vaccines. So this means that there's the possibility of keeping the U.S. military limping around to use as test animals. And the way you're going to need to do it is with a biological terror attack. But there's another problem here, and some people may ask, well, why would the attack be in the United States? Why not have an attack in a small country that is defenseless? This is a really important point. If it's known that another nation, potentially a nation which has an alliance with the United States, is going to be attacked, the U.S. military can get involved in helping defend that nation before the attack. However, unless there's a declaration of war or some other executive action, the U.S. military cannot stop or police the United States homeland from a terrorist attack preemptively. There's concerns about the U.S. military being used for the purposes of collection of and evacuation of illegal immigrants. Some of these have reasonable historical significance that have led to these laws. But these conversations should be had, and I believe that there's a very real reason why the attack needed to happen in the United States, not necessarily just to impact public perception, but also because it's the one area that the military can't protect. This part, by the way, leads us to another data point regarding 9/11. Was the nation of Israel involved? Absolutely. This is how the sausage is made. So did Israel play a role? Yes, but it's not about Israel. Israel is the 49th largest country in the world with respect to GDP. Israel has a low GDP per capita. Israel is not growing that much GDP-wise. I'm not very optimistic about Israel's future. And as an American, I have my own country to worry about. This isn't really about Israel. This is about small territories which can be used for various operations, opportunistically similar to how Ukraine is being used right now. And it has nothing to do with the citizens of Ukraine or the citizens of Israel who are having the life beaten out of them just like the rest of us. It's not about them. Motive. What would the motive be? What would the motive of 9/11 be? Well, first off, 9/11, as it happened, did not result in a biological terror attack. There was no biological terror attack on 9/11. 9/11, as it happened, did not lead to the United States military needing to be subjected to experimental gene therapy. 9/11, as it happened, did not lead to massive budgetary decreases for the U.S. military. 9/11, as it happened, led to increased U.S. military spending and somewhat of an alleviation of U.S. military requirements to take experimental vaccines as it happened. If it happened in a different way, let's say that there was some people and some stolen crop dusters dropping weaponized anthrax from Plum Island or somewhere else on crowds in New York City around Thanksgiving or Christmas. killing a few thousand people, and then flying the planes into buildings, planes which were small but contained the components necessary to create a small improvised nuclear weapon, hence blowing up the Twin Towers. That would have resulted in the U.S. military falling under total control for some period of time of FEMA. That would have resulted in FEMA being involved in control of potential wartime decisions, including the need for the U.S. military to sign up for experimental gene therapy. That would have included an increased budget for a new alternative homeland-based military called the United States Department of Homeland Security, which can then do things which the U.S. military can't and get more and more budget. In other words, the ability of the United States military to persist at all was at stake in 2001. And the only way the United States military survived and got budget and spared its own soldiers from being subjected to an experimental gene therapy vaccine is a preemptive activity, which is 9/11. 9/11 is about the U.S. military and other related forces taking preemptive actions to fight potentially another enemy domestically. This is a motive that is in the trillions and trillions of dollars. This is about really the very existence of the United States military entirely. Other motives that people have passed around are that a friend of George Bush's uncle's brother or something like that made of $10 million on a stock trade. Other motives is that there's a Jewish businessman who bought insurance on the Twin Towers and then made a couple $100 million or something like that after the towers were collapsed. Other things are that people that they wanted to support Israel and help Israel blow up the United States so Israel can control the United States. Other theories include Venetians, pyramids, space aliens, and everything else. There are so many other wacky theories. This, although perhaps not necessarily 100% correct, it is the most robust, complete, logical, sensible motive ever put together regarding what happened around September 11th, 2001. And these actions killed thousands of people. This is not a, the good guys win necessarily kind of story. I want to reiterate, this is involving the death of thousands of people, assuming all the deaths were documented as they happened. However, keep in mind that I'm coming at this from a standpoint of highlighting several 100,000, if not 1 million deaths combined from an engineered drug, fentanyl epidemic, opioid epidemic, including hospital protocols engineered to murder people in a very sneaky way, getting them on supplemental oxygen at lethal levels, or levels which put them into a state where they were then killed with the rest of the protocols. We are talking about this desire to advance the Human Genome Project, which is morally flexible enough to sign on to murdering several 100,000 people in order to shape and sculpt narratives to advance these medicines. So whatever the military did or was part of on 9/11 and its thousands of deaths, please keep in mind, well, if there's a battle that is ongoing over resources and security within the United States, the alternative is willing to sign off on 500,000 to 1 million Americans being murdered. Then does that mean that the U.S. military is wonderful? I mean, every decision they make is about peace and love and prosperity? Of course it doesn't. But keep that in mind. And that is a part of the equation that, as far as I know, aside from Jonathan Cooey, Joe Marshall, maybe a couple of others I never discovered, has never been vocalized anywhere. Anywhere. It's simply, the military wants money. Now they're creating a vaccine because they want to kill people. And that's it. That's all you hear is that part of the story. Or you hear, the CIA did it. So, the title I have today is Robert Malone Helps Us Understand It. So, if there was going to be an experimental gene therapy mandated for the United States, for U.S. military to sign up for, okay? No choice. what's going to happen with the data? Because the data is what it's all about. It's about the test animals or the people, and it's about the data. Well, the data would be collected by the U.S. military, right? Right? How is that going to help interests outside of the U.S. military? Well, here's the problem. The top hospital protecting the U.S. military is Walter Reed. And Walter Reed has one and only one top hospital in Maryland, has one and only one center of excellence. In other words, institution outside of the U.S. military. I'm going to give them a chat a moment. Who do you think that, what institution is that? There's only one institution at the U.S. military, key hospital, Walter Reed has a center of excellence relationship with. Because if the U.S. military was being subjected to experimental gene therapy, all 3 million strong, okay, that data is going to be built up within the VA and within the U.S. military, and it's going to be difficult to access unless there's some loophole. Brother Spoon got it right. Love you, Brother Spoon. Winber. Someone that came up with the idea in 1999. You guys are good. You guys are at the tip of the spear. And it was actually 99 or 2000 to take a small hospice care hospital in Winber, Pennsylvania, connected to Johnstown. It's a small old mining town, okay, and convert it into a leading cancer research hospital with a high-speed data pipe to Walter Reed. Why? Now, on the surface, I think we all want to be happy. Look, I mean, that area is economically depressed. If they can get a few engineers and scientists in there, who will buy some decent homes and hire some services and get their economy going, great. That's awesome. But I don't think it's that simple. This research center had all of its computing set up by Robert Malone. Robert Malone, who was working at the University of Maryland in the 1990s, previous to that Salk Institute, left to join the United States Uniformed Health Services in the year 2000 to help set up a computer center at this small, brand new, effectively on-staffed cancer research hospital in the middle of the mountains in Pennsylvania at this Winber Cancer Center. Why? They didn't even have patients. And then he trained someone was flown in from Nigeria to become its director, a man named Richard Somiari and his wife, who didn't even have their PhDs finished yet. Remember, Malone, just a year before, was the whistleblower, if you will, going to Cheryl Gay Stolberg of the New York Times about the death of Jesse Gelsinger from adenovirus vector gene therapy. So here we are. And then after 9/11, September 11th, 2001, almost like within a day, Robert Malone and his wife Jill Glasspool Malone, who both joined the Winber, left and went somewhere else. It's like, I guess they finished it right after the activities. Now, this Winber Center is only 10 miles away as the bird flies from where Flight 93 crashed. That plane that crashed on a hilltop in the middle of Pennsylvania. Now, I still don't know why they hit that area with a missile. I don't know what happened with Flight 93. But I do know if you look at the photos from where Flight 93 was said to have crashed, you're left with only one explanation, and a missile hit that area. No plane was ever found. They did find mail, though. Supposedly, some of the boxes of mail, because, domestic flights are used to carry United States Post Office mail. And it's strange because Newark Airport on September 10th, 2001, had an unprecedented fire in the mailroom where tons of mail disappeared. Probably the same mail that after a 6-hour drive was found in the fields of Pennsylvania and was said to be mail that came from Flight 93. I don't know what happened to Flight 93. I don't need to make a statement that there was no Flight 93 or it landed safely or it's a hoax. I don't know. I don't need to resolve that. All I know is that what hit there was not a plane. And it's painfully obvious. I even think if you look at some of the mail, you'll notice that there's mail for New Jersey. Why is there mail on for New Jerseyans going out? Oops, I think some people missed that one. Anyways, why they chose that hilltop, I think it might because it's a tall hilltop and it can be used as a communication beacon between Walter Reed and Windber. I think the U.S. military actually saw it as a place to be able to build a communications beacon to intercept health records and other cancer data which was being sent to Windber. That Windber Center, by the way, 20 years later, is now known as the Chan Soon Shung Cancer Research Center. So just to review, Patrick Chun-Shung bought and controls the building, which is the one point of access to health data and cancer data of the U.S. military. If my theory was true, that would mean that there needs to be a way to access the cancer data and the records, other health records within the U.S. military. Well, isn't it odd that one data point, that one vulnerability would be Walter Reed, and the one center of excellence is Windber, and that is where Robert Malone worked, specifically according to his own resume that he updated in 2021. He updated it to cross that part out because it was clear that the the COVID-19 narrative was coming off the rails, and he needed to clean that part up. This is motive. Is it justification? I don't know. That's a really grotesque statement and a leap to make. But what would be big enough for there to be U.S. military involvement, maybe even cooperation with a foreign nation, young nation like Israel, to facilitate these types of attacks? Now, the other part here is that if using the word attack suggests that the World Trade Center was blown up or destroyed by the U.S. military. And here's the question, was it? Because the narrative as it was being told by the forces around advancing the Human Genome Project and gene therapy and everything else and Health and Human Services, those forces were already telling us that the Twin Towers and other major infrastructure was subjected to suitcase nukes. In other words, those buildings were going to be blown up already. It was a ticking time bomb, literally. It was a ticking clock. Now, what I've also read is that it was widely speculated that if there was going to be a biological terror attack, that it would probably happen during a holiday. I suspect that when the small planes, they weren't going to be jumbo jets, with their dropping aerosolized anthrax onto crowds, maybe with their small suitcase nuke device in the back seat, flew into the World Trade Center, they projected that that would happen on a holiday. I think the plan was to not blow up buildings that were fully loaded, but these ideas were still out there. I am making accusation that the forces behind advancing the Human Genome Project and fighting cancer and getting cancer vaccines out there are so godless and diabolical that they are willing to kill people by the hundreds of thousands if necessary. I wouldn't be totally surprised if they would have blown up those buildings with 50,000 people in them. And why shouldn't I be able to make that statement? Because the very same people right now are dead silent on an opioid epidemic that's killed 1 million people and have never brought up the topic of supplemental oxygen and COVID-19 protocols. The evidence is that the same group of people that were behind controlling COVID-19 narratives and are disallowing conversations about the deaths of up to 1 million people unnecessarily for the COVID-19 narrative are the same people that are now also trying to get involved in saying the military is responsible for 9/11 and the military exclusively. Well, I'll tell you what, if you're willing to kill up to 1 million people for COVID-19 narratives, it's not that much of a stretch to think that you also would have pulled the pin and killed 50,000 people in fully populated World Trade Center. Why not? 50,000 is just 5% of the opioid epidemic. No, you don't even talk about that. But there is no evidence of a civilian-staffed, and I stress, U.S. civilian-staffed military. There's no evidence of a U.S.-staffed civilian military killing Americans 50,000 to a million at a clip. There is no evidence of that. Is there evidence of malfeasance? Yes. Is there evidence of corruption? Yes. Is there evidence of doing things to get contracts? Yes. There's lots of palms being greased. There's a lot of things which are criminal, potentially even reaching the level of a death penalty level. Yes, those things have happened. But seriously, almost nothing at the level of what the Human Genome Project is willing to do. So let's talk motive. How much is the U.S. military worth? Well, yeah, they are taking away budget, but also back of the napkin math. And back of the napkin math is always silly math. But if the average death is unnecessary death lawsuit is $500,000 or up to $10 million in the United States, that would mean that the value, if every person were to die of experimental gene therapy in the U.S. military, is what, 3 million, is about $3 trillion, is somewhere between $3 trillion to $30 trillion. And I ask you, $3 to $30 trillion worth of experimental test animals and data. Is that a big enough reason and the opportunity to wipe out the U.S. military or severely weaken it and then build a new homeland-based military which would also cooperate with the forces that are behind advancing knowledge of the Human Genome Project? That is what I call motive. Motive to do a biological terror attack. Stage it, create it, maybe even blow up some buildings and remind people that nukes exist. And what would motive be in preempting it? The motive in preempting it would be to sustain the U.S. military and to defend the 3 million strong U.S. military against a potentially deadly and highly carcinogenic experimental gene therapy vaccine. Robert Malone will tell you all about this because who was found guilty of doing the anthrax letters? A man named Bruce Ivins. And the book Mirage Man documents Bruce Ivins. This is a controlled narrative book. But the female scientist who went to the FBI that said Bruce Ivins was the person most capable or likely to having done those anthrax letters, you know, the follow-up, trying to get 9/11 in the preemptive attack to be about biological weapons again. Her name was Nancy Hagewood. And this book provides evidence that Nancy Hagewood knew Robert Malone since 1989. So the same man that was the whistleblower for Jesse Gelsinger, the same man that worked at the Winber Lab, is also a friend of the female scientist who said that Bruce Ivins did it since 1989. In other words, it's likely that Robert Malone worked his Rolodex and found someone who could create a mythological background about Bruce Ivins, because Robert Malone himself may even be involved in the anthrax letters. These are books such as When the Pentagon Was for Sale that document the bleeding of technology and funding of the United States military throughout the 1980s. These are pretty dry books. Inside America's Biggest Defense Scandal by Andy Pastor. It involves a story about United States telecommunication companies such as GTE being used as ways to be able to extract patents, technology, and so on, and other military secrets out of the U.S. military to drain it because there was a war against the U.S. military, not by Russia, not by Iran, not by Germany, not by Turkey or Saudi Arabia. It was from the other forces within the United States itself and potentially global governance that wanted that pile of money to be used for other things. This is a book about a friend of Robert Malone's, indirectly, Larry Gostin, who's writing about emergency public health law in the event of, for states anyways, the State Emergency Model Powers Act or whatever it's called, going all the way back to 2000 and 2001. Larry Gostin is a big friend of Fauci and Rebecca Katz. I mean, you have the books from other Robert Malone associates, such as Stephen Hatfield, who was accused of the anthrax letters, writing books telling us about COVID-19 anyways. Michael Osterholm telling us about biological terror attacks in 2001. And then you have Judith Miller telling us about biological terror attacks in 2001. A book that is about the U.S. military taking experimental gene therapy vaccines in response to a biological terror attack. Vaccines which advanced because of the Human Genome Project, vaccines which were DNA vaccines, and it includes frequent references of the people who went on to run the 9/11 Commission. This is a book about techno-bandits, all kinds of espionage in the United States computing industry throughout the 1970s and 1980s. It's not because Russia suddenly had a bunch of kids and money. Okay? This is about turf wars within the United States of America. And I will reiterate that some of these needed to happen. We do need to rethink the nature of conflict, military conflict, the nature of nation states based upon advances in technology and so on. These are not conversations which people should avoid, but behind the scenes, oh man, it's bad. It's bad. And say what you want. I mean, you know, look at all these awful, horrible Hollywood movies portraying the U.S. military. The simple assessment is this, is that the non-military forces, which are such a huge part of COVID-19 and fund the majority of my competition. Most people who see shows which compete with mine go from no viewers to 100,000 subscribers in like 2 years. Where do you think the money comes from? Why is it that 100% of other podcasts out there that are trying to do truth digging are all 100% against U.S. military? That's different than being against war. They think the military is actively trying to kill Americans. What a weird statement. We have a civilian-staffed military. People in my audience have their children. I have some of my best friends with their children, and now, sadly, almost grandchildren, going to the U.S. What, do you think they just suddenly want to start killing Americans? It doesn't make any sense. But the funding that goes into pumping up things like that, and it even comes from Hollywood through the Harvey Weinsteins, and sadly Tucker Carlson as well. Look at Tucker Carlson's track record over the last few months. Look at how anti-military it is. Rabidly anti-military, without a willingness at all to state the opioid epidemic, to state hospital protocols, to state the possibility of massive quantities of placebos being used for COVID-19 shots and so on. In other words, same thing. Focus on all this one group here, even say the military allowed 9/11 to happen, while no criticism whatsoever on other piles of money. And that's where we're at. I wouldn't be able to make such bold statements with absolute, I believe in a God conviction, if other channels simply talked about the opioid epidemic. What I see is a war against hearing the real numbers. A desire to ever even mention it. Motive. Is it a justified motive? I don't have to say that. But it's a motive. It is a motive that is not somebody making some money. It's a motive that's not, it's the Greater Israel Project. It is a real motive that's rooted in more power and more money than any other motive I've ever seen anyone else put out there ever. Which means it's probably on the right track. And when you're trying to solve a mystery, you don't have to come up with the final answer. You come up with the next best answer. And eventually people have to realize, or they will realize, that's way closer. And then you go there and then you're like, okay, so what doesn't line up next? And maybe I'll be part of figuring that out, or maybe not. I don't know. Whatever the case, this is a motive, of an explanation for what had happened. And it's rooted in Bio 911 truth. It's rooted in understanding that we are beyond resources. We are beyond, these old border wars. Yeah, I know they're fought in different parts of the world, etc., and they always will be. But this is about the fight for the Human Genome Project being at the root of it all. I wanted to get to it. It was a really good question here. What role do you think Andrew Marshall played in 9/11? I think Andrew Marshall was appointed by, appointed by Richard Nixon. I think Richard Nixon, all the way back in the year 1970, knew that the nature of military conflict was going to change, like it or not. I mean, this is the truth. I mean, you could kill people these days with remote control drones. You can have tiny little drones that are the size of dragonflies flying around, swarming people, and then killing them with fentanyl. And you can do it with the push of a button. So these types of technologies dramatically change the nature of warfare and how we use people in warfare. These need to be discussed. These need to be rolled in. It's not to say, oh, let's get rid of the military. It's not to say double the budget. Okay, but things are changing. Military itself has changed as the nature of technology has changed. That used to be about whoever got more soldiers could line up more people and absorb more cannonballs. And whoever runs out of people after being smashed by cannonballs, well, I guess they win the conflict. So, yeah, things have changed a lot. They do need to be discussed. They do need to be factored in. And I think Andrew Marshall was put there to address, because it was the Office of Net Assessment, and it was to assess the threats, the real threats to the military, and to factor in changes of technology and where to invest. And for the betterment of the United States, that might include defunding the military in some cases. What Marshall did was he was allegedly a very rare brainiac. And he kept a pretty low profile at the Office of Net Assessment. And I think it was at some point identified, okay, this is speculation. I want to be clear. This is speculation. I suspect that it was identified that the level of moral flexibility and lack of fear of a creator are two things which are very high in scientific communities. And I think that a threat to national defense is the fact that we have a growing piles of money in populations of people that believe we need to pursue scientific endeavors and create God, as opposed to military conflict between God-fearing people. I think Andrew Marshall understood that what was being planned for the U.S. military very well could have been the end of the nation. I think he saw it as a bridge way too far. And as an arbiter, I think Andrew Marshall signed on to what we saw happen on September 11th, 2001. He's the only position where someone was in the same position for 50 years running an agency within the United States government, the Office of Net Assessment within the U.S. military. And I think this is the reason why Joshua Lederberg remains, even though he is one of the most important Americans to know about over the last 70 years, a name that no one will say. I suspect that towards the latter part of his life, probably in the 1980s and sometime in the 1980s, I think Joshua Lederberg started to realize the extent that the pursuit of the human genome was willing to go. And perhaps the mass murder of Americans in order to achieve it wasn't such a great deal. And I even think that Joshua Lederberg, with his background in transfection and knowing what viruses are, I think he saw limits of what could happen based upon these different pursuits. He probably tried to tell other people within the Human Genome Project, look, you're gonna only get this far. And they're so proud of themselves, their egos got in the way, and I think they started to shut him out. It was stated that Lederberg was one of the only big minds in the world of genetics that the U.S. military trusted. I think he told them, like, guys, I got some bad news. This is what's going to happen. Along with a few others that started to envision that. They started to realize that sometimes in the 1980s. One name that I can't figure out is Kissinger. I think Kissinger saw both sides of this. I don't know where Kissinger aligned, but These are the real games. They weren't talking about how to make a strategic missile defense. They were talking about the nature of defense in general. They were talking about all of the options of new technologies coming out with respect to defense. And they were also talking about the real threat that, look, if the United States didn't care about advancing genetics at all, another nation would have, and the U.S. definitely would have lost its power. So again, there's reasons to say, look, even if you're not on board with gene therapy, the U.S. should maintain a strong technical position in it for the purposes of national security. So these are the discussions that are happening. And when they're talking about missile defense, they're talking about advancements in computing. When they're talking about AIDS, they're talking about a gene delivery mechanism or a backbone which could be reused for the purposes of gene delivery. You almost need like a little translator tool. There's the things that they say they're doing and they're worried about, and then there's what's really happening behind the scenes. So as you can see, I have some gray areas here. I don't have it quite all figured out. But I have no doubt whatsoever that the money involved in and the battle for control over these pursuits is at the top of the list. And when you see one plan about this bioterror attack, it was obviously preempted. You just look at the books, the movies which are coming out. They actually had to shelve movies. That movie, Buffalo Soldiers, came out September 9th, 2001. If Harvey Weinstein knew every detail about what was going to happen, why would he release a movie like that, so derogatory, so predictive of what the narrative was going to be, and then have to hold off on 2 years? That movie, Buffalo Soldiers, is a smoking gun. That not just these are inside jobs, but there are inside jobs sometimes to preempt inside jobs. That's a real battle. That's how a real modern warfare would work. And if nothing else, Robert Malone at least gave us that much. All right, that's an hour 16, a little more than I wanted to do. That's motive. Find someone else who's put forth a motive that isn't related to a little bit of money or religion or something like that. That's motive. All right, guys. Thank you. Take care. Talk to you tomorrow. Love you. God bless.